Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Tom de Vleesschauwer, Senior Director in charge of Future Mobility at S&P Global Mobility. Now, for those of you that wondered, did I miss the January podcast? Well, we did not have a January podcast, so the good news is you didn't miss anything. January was quite busy, big CES event in Vegas and also the NADA event. Now, in today's episode of Fuel for Thought, we'll be discussing what's likely to shape our industry in 2024 and beyond. I'm sure that most of you will have heard about the softening of the EV market, as well as increasing media coverage concerning sustainability and the associated future pressures that this could bring to your business. And since we're only a few weeks away from the annual S&P Global flagship CERAWeek and Innovation Agora event in Houston, Texas, we will preview some of the panel discussions that will be held there with several industry leaders. So I'm pleased to be joined today by Genette, Senior Research Analyst, MHCV team, and Anoop Desai, Executive Director for Sustainability. Welcome to both of you. Now let's get started. And as I already mentioned briefly, it sure feels like the EV market is experiencing a slowdown. And maybe Anoop, why don't I start with you? While it's sort of a given that currently OEMs are talking about EVs, where is the industry overall heading towards this?
Thanks for having me here. I think it's very interesting times to be in the sector, to be honest and transparent, because it's so turbulent. It's kind of a roller coaster ride. We have been talking about the growth of EVs for the last years, and it seemed like, well, this growth is never going to slow down. The sky is the limit, as they said, is how it seemed like. But of course, we have now come through a bit of a turbulence, as I would call it, that we have seen a slowdown. There are several factors which are actually getting us here, right? It's not just that the consumers are walking away from EVs. That's not the message. We got external market conditions which are that way. If you think of interest rates, if you also think of vehicle prices, which came out as part of the supply chain crisis that was there. Of course, we are kind of seeing a softening on the pricing part as well as the demand is going a bit lower than where the supply stands. But what becomes very clear is this is something that we would see as a temporary effect in the market. This is not something that we are seeing that the market will go back into the ICE world in the future. Today, there is a slowdown. It's attributed to external factors. There are, of course, also some other intricate details involved, such as model policies, some of the models not being ready yet into the market. The first attempt of manufacturers are over, but now it's really about getting it right. So there is a lot of fine-tuning. We do see many a times that there's a lot of fine-tuning happening. But at the same time, we also see a bit of let's say, confusing statements coming out from manufacturers who earlier went all in towards electrification, saying, hey, we are going to take a step back. We are going to keep the ICE running a bit longer or the hybrids running a bit longer. So those statements do cause a matter of concern in the moment. But at the same time, when you think of a bigger picture perspective, why are we doing all of this, right? It is to make the world a better place to live in. It's to control climate change to the best extent we can. It is, of course, not, weather god is not within our control. But at the same time, I think every measure that we can take in that direction, we should be doing that effort. So from that perspective, the current market conditions, of course, seem a lot more pessimistic and conservative than how I would normally have responded, saying we are going in the right direction of limiting global warming. From a sustainability perspective as well, before I forget, something to add on is when we think of how we look at our products and services within the market catering to the industry, if you look at our vehicle performance and compliance analytics suite, which basically talks about what kind of emissions do we see coming out of vehicles, this is an active tool that the industry is using to measure Scope 3 emissions downstream, category 11 to be specific, use phase of the product. So this emission measurement is something that's become more and more critical, especially during these turbulent times to look at, because that's one of the major contributors to the corporate footprint of car manufacturers. So it's interesting times ahead. we are keeping our fingers crossed to make sure that we are decarbonizing at the pace that's required. But of course, the turbulence in the moment could be a bit rocky.
Thank you for that, Anoop. And I think, Greg, that sort of nicely leads into maybe asking you about, well, what's the sort of, do we have a sense of a similar sentiment in the market for EVs, but for the medium and heavy commercial vehicle sector? And do you have some sort of like high-level trends that you might be able to share with us?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. I think in trucking, we're definitely at an earlier stage in the electrified transition, right? And if I had to summarize sort of the time we're in, let's say the last 12 months and looking ahead maybe, into the coming quarters, we continue to really navigate a landscape in flux. And what do I mean by that? There's definitely some growing optimism for electrified vehicles within the commercial vehicle space. But what we're seeing now is these really have to be weighed against some of the challenges for adoption we're seeing. And once we have these trucks being tested and on the roads, we're really seeing those emerge as well. So the way I like to sort of frame like where we're at is, we see signposts that continue to really emerge in both directions. So a positive or maybe in terms of driving electrification, we really see some partnerships forming that are positive. The battery supply partnership here in North America is really a critical signpost we see moving forward, as well as other partnerships regarding infrastructure. These are really notable because it seems to me over the last 8 months or so, OEMs are really appearing to be increasingly more inclined to collaborate with other OEMs on ZEV infrastructure and ZEV products as we move forward. It's really a positive sign. Product availability in terms of OEMs launching new battery electric or fuel cell electric trucks is I'd say a challenge of the past almost as we head into 2024. And then areas like the US or Europe, stringent regulations are driving the adoption of electrified vehicles or other fuel types as well. And then obviously we're watching OEM investments and trends. And then on the flip side, I'd say negative is a bad word, but challenges we see really, especially in the US, we're seeing some financial and production ramp up challenges for new industry players, high costs, limited economies of scale, low adoption rate of EVs has really impacted business performance moving forward. Infrastructure challenges, I talked about those, but I think maybe a little more detailed, not necessarily the availability of these chargers. We expect them to come online, but the timing it takes to potentially get them up and running with other permit or issues, grid issues like that. And then the elephant in the room, the regulatory uncertainty moving into 2024 with the U.S. election looming. We could have some drastic changes moving forward, and that's never, let's say, a good path for straightforward electrification. And then high costs, we still see really elevated fuel cell and battery electric costs moving forward is a challenge. So I think to sort of the takeaway or the wrap up of this question, there still needs a lot to be figured out in terms of the electrification ramp up, but we're certainly at a better place than we were a couple of years ago in terms of the drivers of electrification, the product availability in those aspects like that. So for everyone that follows the light vehicle market a little closer, I think we'll definitely always be quote unquote behind, but things are rapidly changing.
Great. Anoop, can I get back to you on this really and just sort of say, you've already sort of introduced us to the concept of sustainability and then how we start looking at it within S&P Global Mobility. But what do you think is the biggest challenge that the industry is facing?
That's a very good question, Tom. I think to begin with, there is a lack of consistency in regulations, in formats of reporting, and also at the same time, that leads into kind of transparency with regards to the reporting that's being made. It is, given that the regulations are so inconsistent, it's also becoming very difficult to measure how are companies doing as against that of their peers within the same industry and same sector. I can give you some examples. When you think about the reporting of the use phase of the products, as I was mentioning earlier, the Scope 3 Category 11, one of our discoveries was all companies which are reporting the use phase of the product, they kind of have a lot of caveats in there, which reads they're only taking selected markets to report the emission footprint. They're using their own mileage assumptions, which varies from anywhere between 100,000 kilometers to 200,000 miles. So these kind of inconsistencies create a lot of difficulties in understanding and measuring itself on what's going on. And one of the major reasons for this being the governing regulation is pretty wide and also creates some issues with regards to transparency itself. At the same time, while this is something that can be controlled to some extent, right? This is an act which can be controlled with discipline. However, what is going to become more and more tricky is to actually tear down into the supplier network. So as we imagine how cars are today when we look at within S&P Global Mobility, when we think of the use phase of the product, that's very much relevant in an ICE-driven world where majority of the vehicles on the road today in operation are actually powered by combustion engines. But as we go into the future, we go into a battery electric world where in reality, as the vehicles are driving on the street, there is zero tailpipe emission, right? Vehicle tailpipe emission. You don't have any exhaust coming from the vehicle. But what you do have is an emission which comes from the energy grid then, which is in the form of electricity, which has to be looked at. And even with that, we see that the use phase of the product emission will go down massively. However, the focus shifts upstream into the supplier network. And this is where we are currently seeing a major challenge is to tear down the supplier network, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supplier network, getting a measurement of emission across the value chain is the biggest challenge out there. We are actively addressing these concerns. We are looking at different tiers of supplier mapping that we have with our great data assets with very deep granularity. We are rolling them up. We are measuring emissions across the value chain and then building up a life cycle assessment database for vehicles. And at the same time, what this would enable us also to do is kind of measure how can car manufacturers and suppliers within the automotive sector, not specifically to cars, but across the mobility sector, reach their net zero targets? What kind of a path are they on? So it's fun, but at the same time, I can completely comprehend the industry, this being a great challenge.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a little bit of a minefield there, and I think there's also huge potential for probably double counting or miscounting, tier 1, 2, 3 emissions, across the whole chain. So definitely more to be coming on that in the future. Greg, just to sort of, tie it a little bit to that, I guess. We're talking about zero emission fuel types or propulsion types, if you want to call it like that. The way that the media is sort of portraying it, particularly from a heavy truck perspective, is sort of like, well, this is a battle between hydrogen compared to electric. I prefer to sort of say that, we don't want to pick a winner in here. The technology is good. We have to be technology agnostic. What's your kind of perspective on that?
Yes, Tom, actually, you said it perfectly. And I think a lot of the regulators around the world are sort of zero emission, not necessarily a battle between hydrogen and battery electric, but either or. And I think that's sort of what we're expecting for the midterm and the long term. So we've always said it's a dual ZEV strategy. And what I mean by that is battery electric trucks where it makes sense and trucks powered by hydrogen where that makes sense. So, but I think that's well known, and many of people listening to this podcast might have already had that assumption. But we really see battery electric, shorter haul, lighter loads, regional haul applications, and this will definitely be 5 to 10 years ahead of fuel cell based on the overall ecosystem in terms of product availability and costs. Fuel cell and other hydrogen, we see longer routes, things that need quicker refueling time, and something we're seeing a little bit here in the U.S. is work truck applications. So applications that would need to be used beyond just driving long distances, which would be good for hydrogen. But as I said, I mean, maybe we should dig a little deeper as well, because this is sort of, we've been saying this for a while, but what about other cleaner alternatives? We talk about dual ZEV strategy, but we don't see the ICE technically going away, which, will be important for everyone attending CERAWeek in the coming weeks. So when I talk about alternatives, I say, what about some cleaner alternatives to ZEBs, whether that's be hybrids or natural gas, which I think is also sort of a unique aspect of the commercial vehicle market. So first with hybrids, in our long-term forecast, we expect them to also play a role. And why, right? This is something that's not necessarily talked about as much in the commercial vehicle world, but on a macro high level, we see, potential battery raw material issues or shortages, really stringent pressure to comply with regulations in the US and in Europe, and then high cost of ZEVs. And in many cases, it's really an underdeveloped ecosystem. So that's one. And then the second one I want to mention is natural gas powered trucks. Definitely, we expect a good roadmap for higher penetration in the US and then also in mainland China, just based on some regulatory compliance, new products hitting the market, and then fleets looking for that immediate reduction in pollution in CO2. So overall, to answer your question, we don't expect sort of a winner or loser in the zero emission vehicle realm. We would expect both battery electric and hydrogen. And then also it's important to note that we expect IC to remain strong throughout the long term and maybe even beyond just your traditional diesel powered truck.
Right. Talking about diesel, I mean, okay, it sounds like it will still be around for a bit, but when I look at some of our own projections out there, we do start to notice that there is a considerable sort of decline expected in the future in diesel demand.
Yeah.
But some of that might not be just purely because of this transition in terms of propulsion. Are there other factors at play here?
Yes, Tom, that's a good point and something we talk about a lot. So really, I'll be quick here. There's really four major factors beyond the adoption of ZEVs that would decrease diesel or oil demand. So one is fuel efficiency. So we expect in OEMs, especially in the major markets around here, to continue to invest in ICE technology. So to kind of put an example to this, our forecasting compared to 2022 levels, our forecast predicts the fleet-wide average in miles per gallon for a diesel truck in the U.S. will decrease by almost 15% by 2030. So just given that fact is we everything constant, with a vehicle that is more efficient, you would ultimately need less diesel to move that vehicle. So fuel efficiency in the IC is very important. The other one is more high level, is any autonomous or technology efficiency gains. And what I mean by that is not necessarily efficiency gains related to the tailpipe, but efficiency gains in the overall logistics ecosystem. And a good example of this is mainland China. They have a highly inefficient logistics ecosystem. So if you think of factors like autonomous trucking, more technology, larger fleets, and in China, more investment and focus on that drop and hook sort of system. And what all of this does, the bottom line is that, again, all else equal, with greater logistics efficiency, you would need less trucks to move the same amount of goods. So in the long term, this is more of a mid to long term view. We see the need for more trucks to decrease based on some of these overall improvements within the market. And then two smaller impacts are really a modal shift. So we see this in Europe and mainland China, a shift of the movement of freight away from trucking to really reduce CO2 emissions and think of things like rail or waterway. That's a higher level thing. And then obviously the economy. So any softening within the economy on average GDP growth is definitely going to have an impact. Trucking is very closely tied to the economy. So that's something we always have to pay attention to moving forward. So yeah, there's definitely more factors to consider when looking at diesel demand beyond the uptake of your battery electric or fuel cell electric trucks.
Great. Well, I'm sure, we could talk for many more hours, but we don't want to do that. We want to keep it within a reasonable amount of time for our listeners. But these discussions, both of these and others, will be continued at our CERAWeek event in Houston. But so for now, we'll end it here. And I'd like to thank both of our experts for joining us today. And of course, thank you for listening. Please share the podcast link with your colleagues and also on your social media accounts. To read the article that accompanies this podcast, entitled An Increasingly Fragile Mobility and Energy Transition, as well as to opt in to our newsletter that provides more information on these topics and others, please visit spglobal.com/mobility. And we'll be back with more fuel for thought next month. Have a great day.